So, Martin, we've been doing this podcast now all about economic growth and progress for over 6 months, would you believe? And I think there's one elephant in the room that we haven't quite grappled with yet.
Is it the small boats, James? We're finally coming onto them.
Not quite, Martin. I think we might have mentioned them once or twice. I'm talking, of course, though, about the even bigger issue that sort of underlies all of British politics that nobody's talking about, which is, of course, Brexit.
Okay, go on. I'll bite. What is Brexit?
Yeah, it's a weirdly awkward topic to mention. I feel a bit weird mentioning it because it just seems a bit uncool to do so. Like,
Because we are, if nothing else, a cool podcast, James, known for being cool. We don't want to tarnish that reputation.
well, exactly. But this is sort of strangely low status because even though our trading relationship with Europe is, enormously important and has a huge impact on economic growth, if we rejoined tomorrow, it'd add a couple of points to GDP. It's just weirdly feels played out. It feels like so settled, like nobody wants to touch this thing. That to mention it, it's just a bit lame. It's like someone doing, on a phone call going, "What's up?" Like the old Budweiser advert 10 years after it had long gone out of the public consciousness. It's just this old news thing that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah, this is the kind of incisive political commentary that I think people really listen to this podcast for. Uh, but yeah, I think the sort of rational part of my brain says, there's the cost of Brexit, obviously, but then there's the cost of actually doing Brexit administratively. And if you rejoin, then do we even have the administrative capacity to cope with that? How much is it going to cost? What else could we be doing with all of that time and effort? It just sort of feels a little bit like your hair, James, in the sense that it's something we just need to accept is gone and in the past and move on to, better things in the future. And I mean, also, if I'm being completely honest, the FBPE people are really bloody annoying. The sort of people who think that R.S. Archer is a real person living in a French chateau and not a sad weirdo in a basement.
I agree with you, Martin. I'm, a hardcore Remainer at heart, but whenever I see those sort of FBPE people with their EU berets, the blue berets with the yellow stars on, I just think, oh, these are the worst people in the world. Sign me up to reform. So
Yeah, I think in any debate, it's always best to go with the people who are better dressed. I think if there's anything we've learned, that's that.
yeah, so like I say, Martin, it's very low status, and the high status thing for us to do is to talk about industrial policy and planning. So I guess that's what makes us cool now. But the reason I mention Brexit is because last weekend there was another little bit of friction added at the border between the UK and Europe. So the EU introduced the entry-exit system, EES, which is slightly more wieldy to say than just entry-exit system. And it's basically going to make going to the EU more like going to America for British people. So when you get to the border, you're going to have to do your biometrics, get your fingerprint scanned and your photo taken. And then next year as well, the EU is also launching electronic travel authorization. So this is going to be basically like the ESTA when you go to America. So before you go, you're going to have to go onto a website, fill in some forms, say, tick a box saying, no, I'm not a terrorist. And then you're going to have to pay, I think, €20 for the privilege of them saying, yes, you can come in.
I mean, people sort of laugh at the terrorist stuff, but I can't
Mm.
even guess an Esther because I've basically been to so many dodgy countries that they're not really convinced anymore that I'm not a terrorist. Actually, last time I went over to Philadelphia in October and I got held at the border and interrogated for about half an hour.
Oh, my God.
And, not only did they go into my kind of past career and what you do and all this kind of stuff, but they were very curious about the fact that I traveled overland from Turkey into Iraq. And at several points, they just asked me, have you, given any aid to terrorists? Perhaps you've given them medical help or advice or supported them in some other ways. Like, we're not accusing you of being a terrorist. We just think you might have some terrorist friends. And I basically just sat there going, no. And eventually they seemed convinced by my easygoing natural charm, James, and let me go. But I'm not
Oh, my
entirely
God.
sure I want to go through that going into France. But I imagine for most normal people, it's probably not too difficult. It's basically just like most countries, right? You have to pay some silly tax and get a bit of paper and get waved through.
Yeah, I think for most people, it's pretty much just fine. You fill in the form ahead of time, you turn up at the border, and it takes ever so just slightly longer, like a few seconds longer, just as the system has to check your thing, or the person at the border has to ask you an extra question or something like that. But the problem basically is with this system, or the challenge that we're going to face, is it changes the throughput of passengers. So take St Pancras, for example, where people get onto Eurostar. There were already extra checks that came in after Brexit, and it meant that they could only process 1,500 people an hour at the customs, at the passport control, which was down from about 2,000. Because, literally just putting a stamp on someone's passport, those extra few seconds, they all add up. They add like 15 seconds a passenger. And then scale this over everyone passing through. And then you have a really big problem because St Pancras has finite capacity to hold people. So I know at one point after Brexit, they were actually leaving St Pancras in trains that were about 2/3 full because they just couldn't get enough people onto the trains fast enough. And now the EES system is being rolled out, and I'm sure there's been lots of planning about how to implement it and make it as smooth as possible. The reality is, it is more friction, so we could see things like that happen again.
I mean, once again, I feel like you've picked the wrong podcast co-host for this segment, because I travel on Eurostar so often that I actually have carte blanche status, which is brilliantly named, by the way, and basically means that when I arrive at St Pancras, I see all of these normal people milling around with their, germs and whatever. And I just get led straight past the queue. I get taken to a nice bit at the end where there's kind of an empty security section. A very handsome, well-smelling man waves me through. I put my bag in. I get stamped in. I'm led to a special area out the back, which is stocked with wine and drinks and snacks. And I sit there and pound half a bottle, get onto the train. An attractive person brings me more bottles of wine, and eventually I kind of stumble off the end in Brussels and stagger to my hotel. So I don't really know what most of this is that you're talking about. But I mean, from what I understand from other people, it's not terribly bad. I mean, it should hopefully be kind of okay. Like they've coped with it reasonably well so far.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any significant reports of problems at St Pancras yet with this system, which, assuming this is the case, that's really good news. However, the reason I want to talk about it this week is because I think there could be another potential looming problem, not to do with passenger traffic on the Channel Tunnel, but to do with freight. So over to Calais, or Folkestone to Calais, the Eurotunnel and the ferries crossing the English Channel, they're going to have to do these EES checks as well with lorry drivers and with freight traffic. And I just think there's a huge potential problem at the Kent portals. I think this could add more delays and make it harder for freight to get in the country. And this is a perennial problem anyway. Every sort of Christmas, we get these stories about massive tailbacks and queues crossing the channel. And I just think I can see this problem coming. I can see these extra checks adding all of this extra faff on for lorry drivers. And I just think there's a really obvious way this whole sort of process could be managed a lot better and make things a lot more efficient, that could allow us to get a lot more through and make things just work a lot better in general. And it's maddening that nobody has done this thing I want to talk about.
Okay, so the Kent portals, as listeners may know, these are collectively the Port of Dover, the Eurotunnel, and Folkestone, right? And basically, James, what you're telling us is that you've got yet another one of your harebrained schemes that you think is going to fix everything and basically make sure that Christmas isn't ruined, I guess, because that's when most of this freight's going to be coming through for at this time of year. So come on, James, spill it. What's this crazy idea?
Okay, yeah, that's right, Martin. We're going to fix all the problems here. So let's take a step back for a moment. Why are the Kent portals important? It's because they're absolutely critical to the British economy. So most durable goods, furniture and computers, electronics and stuff, they mostly arrive on container ships from places like China. They get off at Felixstowe or the London Gateway port. They're relatively straightforward. But what about more time-dependent stuff on the back of lorries? So fresh food. That all comes through the Kent portals. I think 60% of our trade with the EU, which is a lot of that is like agricultural goods and stuff, that all comes through on lorries, crossing on ferries or on trains. So basically maintaining this constant flow of cross-channel traffic is really important. One of the problems with Brexit is that we're so deeply integrated with European countries that you have all these sort of just-in-time supply chains which require this sort of fast crossing. But the problem with this is, Martin, is that the maximum throughput of the Kent portals collectively is constantly changing. So, for example, there are a set number of ferries and trains every week, but then sometimes there's a big storm, which means that ferries can't cross the channel. Or sometimes the trains break down and there's delays and stuff like that.
I mean, this all sounds terribly unlikely, James. Like trains having signal problems, bad weather in Britain, it's all very unlikely.
And that's before we get to the wild card of these new EES checks. And that's just going to add more friction and more points where sort of delays can kick in and compound and basically jam up the border. So that's why you get these huge queues every so often. And sometimes you get these big stories about it. So like you say, every Christmas, we usually have like a travel nightmare story, and you'll see pictures of lorries queued up on the side of the M20 because of some problem or another. And it just becomes sort of nightmarish and horrible.
Yeah, and I think if there's one other thing that we can agree on, other than cows are good, it's that nobody wants to see Santa Claus stuck on the M20.
Absolutely. And the other really interesting thing about this is, and I didn't realize this until I looked into it, is that freight works really differently to how you might expect. So, when you or I, we go on holiday and we cross the channel in a car, then typically you book months in advance, you know exactly which train or boat you're going to cross on. And then in my case, I'll still turn up 3 hours early because I'm so paranoid about missing the train. But freight, it doesn't work like this at all because, like I say, we've got these just-in-time supply chains. You can't plan that far in ahead. So it all works basically on a first come, first served basis. So a lorry driver will be going down the M20, and it's probably only when they're on the road approaching the portals that they'll probably decide whether to take the boat or the train. And so they just have to make a decision there and then, and they queue up and they're sort of squeezed onto the next service.
And that's kind of mad and arbitrary. I guess it probably doesn't make a huge difference to the lorry driver, although the boat is slower, so they end up there. But I don't know. That's slightly blown my mind.
And fun fact, Martin, the lorries actually go on completely separate trains to the rest of us. They don't drive into the enclosed Eurotunnel train that you take your car into. They actually get clamped onto open wagons, and then the drivers go and sit in a passenger carriage that's been tagged on to the train.
And I think the key thing here, James, is does it have the same selection of onboard wine offerings that carte blanche status on the passenger Eurostar does? Because I'd be pretty disappointed if I was a lorry driver stuck on a Eurostar for 3 hours and I couldn't have a good beverage. Although I suppose if they're driving on the other end, probably not the best idea. Lorry drivers coming into Calais like sozzled on red wine.
Yeah, I dare say it's not quite up to your expectations, Martin, though I am told that lorry drivers, though the ferry takes longer, they will often prefer to take the ferry than the train because the ferry has sort of better food options and it's just slightly more comfortable for when you're taking a break.
Yeah, it's probably quite a nice way to get across. You can, have a nap. It's a slower pace of life. You can watch the sea go by. But I guess ferries are going to be a little bit more difficult if there's one of our, famous autumn storms that's preventing a crossing. So, what happens then? Because you've got all of these lorries piling down the M20. Some of them are expecting to go onto a ferry. That's not happening. There aren't any more trains that are going to be able to run. So what happens?
Yeah, so at the moment, there's basically two plans for dealing with this. So since 1988, there's been Operation Stack, which basically closes part of the M20 and forces lorries to park up along it. The plan is basically everyone parks up and waits, I think.
That's a fine tradition of British plans. Like, wait, all these lorries are stuck, on the motorway. What can we do? How should we deal with this? I know. Why don't we just ask them to park where they are and wait for the foreseeable future? That's a plan, isn't it? Yeah. What should we call it? Stack. Done. Right. Let's go home and have a beer.
Don't get me wrong, Martin. Since Brexit, things have got slightly more sophisticated. So since then, we've had Operation Brock. And what this does, it puts movable barriers on the motorway and basically helps move lorries off the M20 and sends them elsewhere to wait. So in one case, it sends lorries up to Manston Airport, which is long closed down in North Kent. It's about 20 miles north of Dover. And it will just send up all the lorries there to park up and wait there. So same thing again, just everyone queues up. And I think the fundamental thing is that these plans do get the situations under control a bit. But the problem is they're fundamentally emergency measures. They're sort of sticking plasters on what is a pretty broken system. So, every time the plans are rolled out, every time ferry crossings cause problems, you roll out this plan and it's a huge faff. The police, local authorities, I guess the highways agency, they all have to coordinate on rolling out the plan, on diverting traffic, on putting out cones. It's just a big hassle and it's just a bit of a mess.
Yeah, and it's got to be pretty miserable for lorry drivers, right? And I mean, let's be honest, they're not cheerful people to start with. It's not good for your mental health listening to podcasts and LBC for 15 hours a day.
Yeah, so I think this is a big problem because being a lorry driver, it's a really, really hard job. I imagine all of that out of touch middle class professionals listening to this can't even comprehend how sort of wearing it is driving a lorry for that long. They typically drive for 4-hour stretches and take 45-minute breaks. And I'm sure being stuck in a lorry is slightly nicer than being stuck in a car, because truckers, they typically have a bed in their cabin. They've maybe a little microwave so they can eat, but it's still, way more grueling than we might want to put up with, because for a start, there's not any toilets or anything like that. You can't just jump out
Christ.
and, use the toilet very easily. There's not a toilet block waiting by the side of the road necessarily. You can't just go, oh, well, I'm in Dover, I'm on the Kent coast, I'll go and spend some time at the beach. You've got to stay in your cab.
Yeah, I mean, it's a far cry from the carte blanche Eurostar experience, James, I'll be honest. But I mean, it sounds just sort of infuriatingly predictable. Like, we know that this problem is going to happen. We know that it's going to keep happening on a regular basis, like especially at, this time of year with the weather getting bad towards winter and the sort of winter storms coming in. Surely there has to be a better, more permanent solution than just turning random areas of Kent into a gigantic sort of rebranded car park.
So I think there is, Martin. And to answer this, and bear with me on this, but are you familiar with how things work at Disney World?
So I don't have children. My hobbies are drinking scotch, touring vineyards, and going to remote places where there hopefully aren't many other people. I honestly don't think you could find a co-host who is less familiar with how they do things at Disney World. I just kind of imagine it's full of children and vomit and, the awful like food that Americans eat.
Well, I went to Disney World a few years ago, and that is a pretty accurate summarization of what it was like. I'm a bit of a germaphobe, so there was basically no surface there I enjoyed touching, because it was just so infested with everything.
Like, everyone's like, oh, you should go to Disney World. It's like, oh, what was it like? Oh, it was disgusting and full of awful people, and we queued for 17 hours to go on a ride. But, what a memory. Like, okay, yeah, I'll give that a miss, thanks.
Well, I still enjoyed it, Martin, because we went in February 2020, just before the world shut down. It was the perfect time to sort of do one last, the complete opposite of the world shutting down, going to the busiest place on Earth. But we went there because there was this amazing new ride called Rise of the Resistance, a Star Wars ride, right? I won't go into the details, but I'm sure the nerds who like this podcast will probably go on YouTube now and watch videos of this ride. It's a very cool theme park ride. And Disney knew, though, it was going to be super, super popular. So instead of just opening the ride up and having people queue up outside, because the queues would go back for hours and hours and hours, what they did instead, they actually set up a virtual queuing app. So what you do is you go to the park at 8 o'clock in the morning, or whenever it was that the park opened. You had to go onto the app quick as you can, straight after 8 a.m., and request a slot to get on the ride, where it would then allocate you a boarding group. And then basically you just have to keep an eye on your phone throughout the day. And at a certain point, as the ride was chugging along and getting through people, you get a notification saying, oh, it's nearly time for you to go on the ride. Go over now.
That is pretty cool. Although, obviously, I think effectively at that point it would have been data from a mass COVID super spreader event. But no, I mean, that's a nice system, right?
Yeah, it worked really well. I think we'd done Rise of the Resistance by 9:30 a.m., which was fantastic, because this was basically the entire reason that my partner wanted to go to Florida in the first place.
And then I guess you could get out of Florida as quickly as possible afterwards. Was that the plan? Get in, do the ride, fuck off.
I quite like Florida, but that's a whole other podcast. Maybe we'll get into what I weirdly liked about Florida, even though on paper it should be the worst place on earth. But anyway, so this system, this virtual queuing system, and it worked really well for everyone else as well. You could go around the park, you could see the rides, do the other experiences and so on, and not just stand in a queue all day.
Yeah, and I guess the alternative would be something, I don't know, market related, like surge pricing like Uber do, but I would imagine that would be quite unpopular with families.
Honestly, Martin, I think given how expensive Disney World was already, I think you'd probably have, a proletarian revolution in the central square of Disney World, and, Mickey's head would be on a spike if they tried to sort of raise prices even more.
Yeah, there was an amazing blog post or Substack or something recently that looked at Disney World prices over the last several decades and how they sort of kept low for a long period of time. But over the last 10, 20 years, like suddenly everything's getting very expensive, and lots of middle-class Americans are like, Christ, this is a very large sum of money.
Let's just say I was very pleased that lockdown meant I couldn't leave the house or spend any money for a couple of years after going.
So what does this hellhole have to do with freight, James? Where are we going with this detour?
Oh yeah, we're talking about the Kent portals, because I think this is a pretty obvious connection. Well, we should just do this, shouldn't we? Can't we have a virtual queuing system for the Kent portals. And I do know there is a company already working on this. It's called Eloy. And I just think it's a real no-brainer solution, because you can imagine how a lorry driver, and they're coming into Kent, they could go on this app and say, oh, I want to cross the channel. The app could then, allocate them a space or something like that, and then they could just park up somewhere and wait for their turn. So instead of just parking on the sides of the motorway and hoping for the best, they could go and sit somewhere more comfortable. There's a big truck stop down towards that way, so they could go and park up there and have things like, showers and hot meals. And I think there's even a gym at the Ashford truck stop. But it just seems like a much more humane way of dealing with things. And more crucially, it could help manage this flow of traffic in real time. So we could actually have a sort of a throughput which responds to conditions. It's such an elegant solution, which isn't beyond the wits of man at this point, because we've already invented the technology. It's not that we need to solve a physics problem here. It's literally just make everyone use an app and do something pretty basic.
Yeah, it seems pretty decent. And I mean, if you're a business somewhere in that area, it's a really good incentive to set something up to, help lorry drivers get it on the app and rake in some money from it. And, they could go further with the Disney inspiration. They could have, Goofy and Minnie Mouse standing at the junction, waving the lorries onto the right service, get some, Marvel-themed concession stands going, maybe a Star Wars cantina for the lorry drivers. I probably don't want them drinking too much, as discussed, but, it would be a fun time. The Disney World of Kent, James.
Absolutely. But I think what's really cool about this, it could work even more smartly than that. So at the moment, every lorry that turns up at the border is basically treated the same way. But the goods inside the lorries, they're not all equal. So, if someone's taking live animals across the channel, you could give them priority. So it's like nicer on the animals. Or if someone's carrying dangerous chemicals, they can get priority as well. So you've not just got, a big vat of scary chemicals sat there on the motorway. Incidentally, fun fact, there are certain chemicals that can't go on the Eurotunnel for security reasons, so they have to use the ferry.
Now, I'm feeling very good about using the Eurostar and not the ferry now, James. As if basically what you're telling me is that P&O are just sort of shuttling basically large bombs from France to England on a regular basis.
Well, based on the earlier conversation, Martin, I think you're the person I should be worrying about getting access to these chemicals. So I think you should definitely stick to the Eurostar. I think this could also help as well with congestion further up. So like I said, the big problem is the M20 gets completely jammed up when Operation Stack or Brock get activated. But if you've got an app and all the drivers are on it, again, this is a sort of legible group of people. It's not hard to reach all the lorry drivers. They all know each other anyway. They all use WhatsApp as like they're organizing things professionally. So it's not like, having to reach tech illiterate people. These are all sort of smart, relatively young working age people who can all use apps and coordinate on it, and they're used to doing this thing. That's how they find their work, because a lot of lorry drivers own their own lorries and stuff like that. So you could get them on there, and then you could literally have it. So as someone's even a long way from Kent, if we know there's going to be problems, if we know there's a massive storm incoming, you could have the app say, just chill out a bit where you are, stay a bit further up. So it could help distribute everyone much more efficiently all around the country. And one more thing, like I mentioned as well earlier, that sometimes lorry drivers like to pick the ferry rather than the train because of the nicer food. It's also because of breaks. So lorry drivers, they have to legally take a 45-minute break for every 4 hours of driving. But if you take the train, it's too fast, so it doesn't count as a break. And like lorry drivers will often weigh this into their decision. So you can imagine you could build the app in such a way that it helps lorry drivers so they can basically do whatever works best for them. So it could just make everything better using data without having to build any more physical infrastructure. It just seems like such an obvious idea.
So, I mean, I'm sold, but my opinion is irrelevant. So is there any indication this might happen, that people in charge might adopt this?
So as far as I'm aware, there's no active plans to do this, but I do think that the Department for Transport should see this as such sort of a low-hanging fruit, easy intervention. I imagine it'd be quite cheap as well. And, think about the underlying technology. We've already invented GPS. Virtual queuing already exists and is a proven system. There's this company, Eloy, who have a prototype that they've shown off. So the tricky part is, and this is the bit where the government could be useful, is just gluing all of these things together, making the right stakeholders talk to each other and doing that coordination role. So yeah, why don't we just do this? Because then when Christmas rolls around and there's massive queues and there's all these problems about travel nightmares, then I'm going to be, for one, doing a podcast where I say, I told you so. You should have listened. You should have listened to this idea. But yeah, we'll see, I guess.
I might let you do that one on your own, James.